The air tasted of salt and oil and something older, like the memory of a shore that had been burned, then forgiven. It was morning, but the sun pressed like a hand on the rooftops, making metal sing and dust rise in thin veils. At the gate of the camp, a sign hung crooked on a pole, simple letters that said camp and a number. But inside those letters were 1,000 small verdicts. 79 women waited in a line that had learned to fold itself into silence. Their feet were wrapped in cloth, their hair tied back with strips of cloth that matched the dirt. They smelled of sea salt, boiled rice, soap that had been used beyond saving, and the faint sweetness of medicines kept for a future that never came. They had been taught to hold their gaze low. They had been taught that shame could shield a family name. The van arrived with a grinding of brakes and the smell of diesel. A young American officer stepped out, uniform neat, hat in his hand, and beside him a translator with a hesitant smile, who spoke both languages like a bridge that trembled but did not break. The officer looked at the line, and in a voice that was careful and simple, he said through the translator, "You will be safe." A woman who had been pushing a bundle of cloth forward breathed a single word, "Safe," and the syllable trembled like a bell struck after a long silence. There was an immediate, small confusion, like when two currents meet at sea. Guards on the watchtower shifted, their rifles glinting in the light. An older man in a khaki jacket, the camp commander, watched with the expression of someone counting losses that were not allowed to be losses. This was a place of orders and discipline, where food came at times and cold at other times, and where humiliation had been a currency traded for protection. The promise that morning was a different sort of tender. The officer, Lieutenant Carter, reached into a satchel and produced paper and a small box of pills. He looked at Nurse Hana Ito and said, "We want to help you." And the words landed like a soft hand on a shoulder that had become used to being pushed. Hana answered only with a nod and the memory of the sea in her mouth. The translator, Kenji Sato, repeated the sentence slowly, "We want to help you." The moment seemed absurd and impossible and true all at once. It would not undo what had been taken. It would not remove names carved into quiet grief. But it opened a slit of light. That opening would make some of them cry. They were moved inside for processing. The first room smelled of boiled cabbage and iron. A nurse named Helen Walsh unwrapped bandages with hands that were quick and deliberate. A medic named Dr. Matsumoto, whose own face had a map of small wounds and late nights, checked pulses and made notes with a pencil that left dark marks. The interpreter translated everything, but he also translated gestures, a look that softened, a hand offered. The dialogues in that room stretched like gentle ropes, each pulled tight, then loosened in turns. "What is your name?" asked Nurse Helen softly. "My name is Hana," Hana said. "How long have you been without proper food?" asked Dr. Matsumoto, leaning forward. 3 weeks, Hana answered. "Do you have any fever?" asked Lieutenant Carter with professional worry. "No fever," replied Hana. "Are you with family?" asked Kenji with a voice that sought to make a map of loyalties. "My sister Keiko is inside," Hana said. "Where is Keiko?" asked the medic. "In the next barrack," said Hana abruptly. "We will check on Keiko now," said Lieutenant Carter. "Please," Hana breathed. "You will be helped," Kenji translated. "Will you take water?" asked Helen, reaching a cup. "Yes, please," Hana said, and her hands took the cup with a hunger that made her fingers tremble. "What food do you miss most?" Dr. Matsumoto asked as he filed notes. "Rice and miso," Hana answered, with a small laugh that surprised even her. "You will get proper meals," Lieutenant Carter promised. "You will be seen by a doctor," Helen added. "We will respect your dignity," Kenji said, and that phrase moved through the room with more force than any formal order. The exchanges were simple, but each line extended trust like a fragile bridge. The room had salt on one wall where tears had dried, the smell of alcohol from antiseptic, the metallic echo of trays, the warmth of bodies pressed together, and the quiet rustle of clothing as names were written. Those 5 senses stitched the scene into reality. Outside, guards named Sato, Kuroda, and Fujimoto lingered with arms folded, their faces closed. A cook named Masaru watched from the doorway and later would bring a bowl of thin soup that a woman named Keiko would hold like a life preserver. In the makeshift kitchen, the sound of ladles on metal sang in rhythms that suggested ritual. Rice steamed and condensed butterflies of steam against the light. Mats and crates lay on one side. A woman named Yumi moved with a spoon held like a compass. The smell of dashi rose and filled the space. The American supply truck had brought tinned fish, condensed milk, and a sack of flour. The food was simple but foreign in its generous portions. There, dialogue curved into small jokes, and the first fissures in old teachings appeared. "We will not be hungry tonight," said Masaru with a grin. "We have eaten before and we have managed," answered Keiko with a resolved tone. "You deserve more than manage," Nurse Helen replied. "That is not for you to decide," a guard called out. "You are here," Lieutenant Carter returned calmly. "All of us are here because someone is responsible," the guard said. "Responsibility does not mean hunger," Kenji countered. They spoke like people who had practiced restraint and were now learning to risk small disobediences for larger truths. On a low table, someone placed a worn photograph of a mother and child, the edges curled by years. Hands reached and touched the photo as if to affirm that memory and body could be fed together. In that room, 5 senses were vivid: the hot breath of steam, the sticky weight of stale rice, the metallic clink of spoons, the rough feel of wooden bowls, the faint perfume of tobacco from a man who had given up smoking the day before. Names were spoken like charms. Helen, Kenji, Masaru, Keiko, and Sora, the youngest girl who had not spoken since arrival, all became part of a small social contract of care. Hana carried her past like a bundle that she unpacked in fragments. She had been born in a seaside village where mornings began with nets and the smell of kelp. As a child, she had learned to sweep the floor before anyone else woke, to fold futons with the precision of ritual. Her mother had taught her to keep her chin level and her voice softer than a prayer. At 13, Hana had apprenticed in a clinic to learn to stitch and to soothe fevers. A teacher named Professor Tanaka told her that a steady hand could save a life, and that a steady voice could sometimes save a soul. At 19, the war pulled threads loose. Her father left with a promise that never arrived. She married briefly, a small marriage that dissolved as food grew scarce and fear grew wide. At 22, she had lost a brother in a port that burned at night. Those losses folded inward and made her protect what remained by becoming smaller. She learned discipline like armor. She refused to complain when guards mocked or when companions were taken. She believed that silence might be a shield for those she loved. By the time she arrived at the camp, she was a nurse by training and a ghost by practice. The years had taught her that protection often came as compromise that cost honor, and sometimes that cost love. She kept a worn diary hidden under a loose floorboard, a scrap of paper where she wrote 2 lines whenever the night allowed sleep. Those lines were a private litany of shame and hope. At the camp, she moved through routines as if floating in someone else's life. Meeting Lieutenant Carter and Nurse Helen was the first time that hands reached back. Tension accumulated like weather. Rumors toured the barracks. There might be deportations, reprisals, or a retraction of promises. The camp commander, a man named Yamamoto, spoke in clipped sentences to his officers Jinjiro and Ota, and his words carried the texture of an old rulebook. "They are not ours to release," he said. "We maintain order," Jinjiro replied. "Order has a..." Ota muttered. Outside the gate, a crowd gathered, made up of local men who felt that the presence of foreigners was an insult, and women who watched with curiosity shaded by fear. The first moment of real danger arrived when a rumor said that one of the women had been claimed by a nearby family as an offender. A group of young soldiers from the local garrison began to shout, their voices like stones thrown at glass. Lieutenant Carter stood between them and the women, and his posture was deliberate and open. The crowd pushed, and the guards on the tower called in changes to protocol as if reading from a manual that had never contained mercy. In the heat of that day, a verbal confrontation stretched on for almost an hour and felt like an abyss. "You cannot keep them," the young soldier shouted. "We are allowed to detain for questioning," the camp commander answered. "Questioning does not mean humiliation," Kenji insisted, translating now not only words but the moral arithmetic. "We are responsible for their safety now," Lieutenant Carter said. "We have no right to interfere in your rules," Yamamoto shot back. "You gave them shelter in exchange for obedience," Jinjiro said with a voice that tried to pin meaning like a bird to a wall. The exchanges were sharp and full of small histories. Each sentence opened memories in those who listened. A woman named Michiko pressed her hand to her chest and remembered a father who had taught her to stand straight with a quiet voice. The tension became a pressure cooker. The air smelled of sweat and tobacco and something like fear. Sounds became sharper, almonds of metal clacking, footsteps like measured drums, a child crying at the end of the lane. Two guards moved to separate an argument, and a bowl of soup spilled, hot liquid steaming like a small oil burn on the ground. The scene slowed, and in that suspended moment, the camp hung between two possible histories, one of continued submission and one of a public rupture. The defense came not as a gun, but as an insistence on law and on human sight. Lieutenant Carter requested a meeting with the regional commander and made a small but radical public stand in front of the assembled camp. He spoke in English with the translator Kenji repeating each sentence in Japanese. "These women are people," Carter said. "They will be treated according to international protection and with dignity. They will not be used as bargaining chips," Kenji translated in a voice that shook. "You must understand we respect the authority of this place," the camp commander replied. "Respect does not mean cruelty," returned Lieutenant Carter. The argument became a dialogue of 8 exchanges that were tight as wires. "What proof do you have of authority?" Yamamoto asked. "We have orders and witnesses," Carter answered. "Who will enforce this?" Jinjiro demanded. "We will document and bring it to your superiors," Kenji replied. "If you refuse," Yamamoto snapped, "then the world will know," Carter said quietly. "Do you want your families to know what happened here?" Carter asked directly. The question landed in the faces of the local officers like a mirror held up in sunlight. They shifted. People named in the crowd, including Masaru, Sora, Keiko, Michiko, and Takashi, watched with eyes that cataloged every small motion. At the end of that exchange, the commander stepped back with the expression of a man who had lost a wager he had not realized he was making. A formal note was written. Photographs were taken. Food distribution was increased that day. More importantly, guards were instructed to stop certain practices. The change was symbolic, but it was also practical. That public defense broke a line of authority that had been accepted for years. It did not end fear, but it reoriented it. After the opening came hours and then days of small rituals that rebuilt trust almost by accident. The routine changed in ways that seemed trivial and in ways that were not. Soldiers named Miller and Jackson helped to fix a broken ladder in the laundry area and did it with a kind of awkward humility that made laughter leak out of the women. Nurse Helen taught a simple method to stitch small wounds, and in return, Hana taught Helen how to fold a futon so that it wouldn't wrinkle. The conversations deepened into the long exchange of learning and teaching. "Why do you fold it this way?" Helen asked. "It keeps the body safe when you sleep," Hana replied. "We could show you," Keiko offered, and the two women crouched on a mat to demonstrate. The sensory detail of those quiet hours was intimate. The smell of starch and soap in the linen, the texture of cotton underhand, the creak of the wooden floor, the taste of sweetened condensed milk shared from a spoon, the small bright light of a single bulb thrown against the darkness of a long past. Friendship built like mortar between bricks. Names and faces were cataloged in memory the way sailors map constellations. The translator Kenji wrote down small words for the soldiers to say, like a prayer of respect. "Thank you. Please. I am sorry." Those words began to multiply in unexpected places. An elderly prisoner named Sorrow wrote a line in Hana's diary that read simply, "Thank you," and then left a pressed flower between the pages. There were 3 moments that tested that fragile new architecture, and each one demanded decisions that felt like choosing between betraying a code or saving a person. The first came when an inspection from a higher authority threatened to return women to places they had fled. It was a 2-day drama that narrowed into nights of waiting, and 2 nights of dreams that smelled of smoke. Hana remembered the face of a child on a nightless voyage and sat awake while others hushed like. The second came when a rumor said that food would be reduced again and that punishment would resume for small infractions. The kitchen pulsed with worry as Masaru and Masako argued about rations, and the soldiers looked at supply lists and the names of donors. The third came when a young woman accused of theft claimed she had taken medicine for a fever, and the accusation threatened to reopen old routines of public shaming. Each of these moments required choices. In the first case, Lieutenant Carter argued in a letter with a regional bureau and collected signatures from external witnesses. He wrote with a steadiness that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with habit. The letter was delivered by a courier named Thomas, who had seen battlefields and kept his hand steady by folding the same piece of paper the same way each night. In the second case, Nurse Helen turned to the soldiers and organized a program where they shared surplus from their own rations during the next 2 weeks, and wrote the plan on a piece of cardboard that read, "Community Table." In the third case, the women of the camp formed a small council and spoke for the accused. The dialogue there was slow, and now involved 8 exchanges between the accused woman and her neighbors, and finally a statement from Keiko, whose clear voice had been sleeping. "She took only to survive," Keiko said. "We will not add shame to what they already bear," Michiko added. "If you punish her publicly, you punish all of us," Hana whispered. The council voted to intercede, and their collective voice became a shield that had been lacking. Each moment lasted like a tide and left seaweed of memory on the shore. The rupture became real in a public hearing where the camp commander faced accusation of practices that had become normalized. The hearing occurred in the central yard, under glare, and the tower watched like a silent judge. Men and women testified. Lieutenant Carter sat with a hand on a stack of photographs, and Kenji held a notebook of translations. The dialogue of the hearing stretched to 10 exchanges that functioned like a court of conscience. "Do you deny ordering public humiliation?" Carter asked. "I followed regulation," Yamamoto said. "Which regulation allows stripping of dignity?" Carter countered. "Discipline requires demonstration," Jinjiro answered. "Discipline must not equal cruelty," Kenji translated. "You claim protection, yet you inflict punishment," Carter insisted. "They would have caused unrest," Yamamoto replied. "What is more disruptive, an insult to laws or an insult to humanity?" Carter asked, and the yard held its breath. Other names rose in testimony. Dr. Matsumoto described wounds he had treated. Nurse Helen testified about the care given and the changes noticed. Masaru promised to testify about food allocations. Sato, the guard, gave a statement that surprised the yard when he admitted seeing orders he could not explain. The hearing ended with a formal reprimand to certain procedures and an agreement to enforce minimal standards and to allow external visits. It was not a full victory, but it was visible and real. Tears fell in the yard that day, but they were different tears from the ones that had come in the first moments. They were not only from despair, but from the relief of being seen. 1 month later, there was movement in the camp that changed the cadence of life. A medical team returned with more supplies, and lists for repatriation were begun. The women received letters with rough translations, and some names were crossed off the lists and some added. Keiko began teaching a small class on wound care. A young translator named Emi arrived to assist Kenji and brought with her a small radio that played music that made people laugh and cry in equal measure. Food lines shortened, and a wooden bench was carved and placed near the infirmary where women could sit and stitch together under the light. The first month felt like unfreezing. One heartening story was that of Sora, who received a letter from a niece she had not seen in years, and the two exchanged names out loud so that each syllable sounded like an arrival. The physical world felt quieter, like snow after wind. 3 months after the Americans first stood at the gate, there were formal meetings with the repatriation committee. Officials from outside the region visited and took notes. Some women were listed for return, and others were scheduled for transfer to safer facilities. The camp began to empty in small numbers, and the work of sorting belongings took on an almost ceremonial air. Keiko knelt and tied each package with care, as if to scent each object with a blessing. The epilogue of that period was messy and human. Some families refused to take back those they had abandoned, citing failed honor codes. But other families opened doors with hands that trembled and eyes that shone. Lieutenant Carter wrote recommendations and sent them along with photographs. His small acts of documentation became proof in places that required proof. The translator Kenji sent Hana's diary to a contact who could translate it properly, and the diary came back with additional notes that included names of people who had helped. The women wept at reading the list of allies. They wept for shame and for gratitude. Gradually, the camp's population declined and the barracks became less crowded. 6 months after that first awkward promise, the landscape had changed enough to be noticed. A small plaque was mounted by a local humanitarian group recognizing the need for oversight in such places. Several of the soldiers who had helped returned once to check on the women and were received with a table of rice and tea as if to say thank you in the language it would understand. Some of the women had been repatriated and reported new lives that were fragile and hopeful. Community center had begun to form near the camp gate, where women could learn trades and where children could be registered for school. The relationship between the camp and the outside world had been altered by the insistence of compassion made bureaucratic, by photographs kept and letters written, by the refusal to let shame be the only currency. The legacy of those days took many forms. A small dictionary of common phrases that Kenji had compiled to help communication between soldiers and women became a resource for future translators. A patched futon that Hana kept became a symbol that she would later bring to her village and show as evidence that she had kept herself whole. An official report recorded incidents and recommendations and would later be used as precedent. Names mattered. Lieutenant Carter, Nurse Helen, Dr. Matsumoto, Kenji Sato, Masaru, Keiko, Sora, and Michiko became names spoken with gratitude and with complicated forgettings. Pause for a moment and think about where you would stand in such a situation. Feeling confusion, rage, or empathy are all honest responses. Write in the comments what you would have done if you stood at that gate facing a promise of safety from those you had been taught to fear. Start your sentence with "I would have" or "I feel that" to make it easier to follow others. Your words help create a space where people can share their reactions to dilemmas that have no easy answers. We read your reflections and sometimes find new stories there that guide our next film. Now we return to what happened to the women whose lives were touched by that fragile mercy. In the years after, some went home and others traveled to new places. The memory of being sheltered by strangers remained vivid. Hana returned to her village months later with a small package of seeds and a photograph of the people who had fed her. She reopened the clinic in a house with a sagging roof and began to stitch limbs and lives. Keiko married a carpenter named Takashi who had visited and fixed the clinic's door, and together they taught children how to read and to fold futons. Sora became a midwife and carried in her bag the radio that had once played songs of another land. Lieutenant Carter received a letter from Hana that began simply with "Thank you." and then attempted to name what had been given him in return: the courage to act. He kept the letter and later testified in other hearings where his experience mattered. Nurse Helen returned to her hospital and started a small program training local nurses in cross-cultural communication. The camp itself was dismantled over the following year, but its memory lived in stories told at markets and in the margins of municipal reports. The central lesson that threaded through those accounts was stubbornly simple. Human dignity could be restored not by declarations alone, but by small, concrete actions: meals given, wounds dressed, names, doors opened. The cost was not without friction. There were resentments and confusion and people who could never forgive. But the act of protection had shifted the moral ledger. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more narratives that shine a light on moments where ordinary people faced impossible choices and sometimes chose compassion. Your subscription helps keep these stories researched and told with respect for those at the center. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that small acts can change the arc of a life. The tears that fell in the camp were not just tears of despair. They were also the first rain after long drought. The real protection begins when someone says you are seen and then stays to prove it.